Deleted text threads and potential show causes, plus 12 teams that need just a little bit to go their way to make the upcoming 12-team playoff. This is the College Game Day podcast for Tuesday, August 6th. Rece Davis and Pete Thamel actually sitting side by side on
with our whole team
on the Bristol campus. Yeah, and I'm here maybe 12 to 15 days a year now. So it's
probably half the time I'm here.
Yeah?
Yeah. Well, you live closer sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yes.
Occasionally. This time of year. Live a little bit closer. How was the trip in, Pete?
Oh, it was fantastic, Rece. Traffic
coming from your palatial
traffic,
quarters.
pouring rain, and obstinance from Pitbull's camp. Other than that, it was awesome. No,
this is a
good.
glamorous life you lead now, dealing with Pitbull on your drive-in from...
If you need Yelp reviews of different off-the-highway gas stations in the greater Connecticut area, I have quite a few. If you want the different granola bar selections available at them, I could go through. It is a fun story, a good podcast story. Pitbull is going to be... buying the naming rights, paying FIU $1.2 million a year for the naming rights for what was known as FIU Stadium. The artist formerly known as FIU Stadium will now be Pitbull Stadium. So when the Central Michigan Chippewas play there on September 7th, they will be playing in Pitbull Stadium without their quarterback coach.
that sounds like a very good note for the College Station edition of College Game Day, to remind everybody that Pitbull Stadium is now in play for the Panthers of FIU. Before we get into the breakdown, which I think you've been with us in the offseason, we've decided with the new 12-team playoff that we're breaking teams down rather than going through conference team by team, breaking them down in groups of 12. The first group of 12 we did long shots. Maybe if lightning strikes, they get in the playoff. This group of 12 teams that we'll talk about today, they don't need a lot. In fact, they might be able to take care of it themselves, but at least in our judgment, they are going to wind up most likely just on the outside of the playoff, but they are certainly contenders, and if they develop and things go their way, very easily could be in this inaugural 12-team playoff. But before we start breaking down teams, one of the teams that both of us have in this group is Michigan, reigning national champions, and now all of the Connor Stalions stuff coming with the documentary about to come out, with some of the answers potentially and actually hearing from Connor Stalions. But through some investigative reporting of your own, you got to look at a draft of the notice of allegations toward Michigan, which are not flattering to most of the Michigan guys who are gone. Jim Harbaugh had a great statement in response. But first of all, tell us exactly where we are, what you know, and what potential impact it could have on Michigan for the upcoming season, if any.
So, macro, 7 coaches from the 23 staff are alleged to have wrongdoing in this draft of the notice of allegations. And we should put all the qualifiers in here. Drafts of notice of allegations can change. It is just a draft. And a lot of times, Rece, these are inflection points to start working towards a negotiated resolution, which Michigan had tried to do around this time last year in this case. If you look at precedent, because there's a lot of repeat violator things going on here, I don't know if we'll get to a negotiated resolution. I was told it's all, like, just in terms of timeline and precedent, it's really highly unlikely any of this is going to be resolved before the start of the season. That would be shocking to everybody as it went. It's complicated. They could break some things off and work some different things. But I think the macro is there were 7 coaches from the 23 staff. Now, only one of those coaches remains. So obviously the news out of this became that Sharon Moore is in the crosshairs in this. Now, it says he could be suspended and he could face a show cause. But then it is a level 2 allegation. Now, he is a repeat violator. That's not an if, and, or but. He violated, and now he will be treated as a repeat violator. So,
whether you like that or not, because that all stemmed from some nonsensical contact of a recruit during COVID. It's not anything terribly nefarious or sign stealing. It's something that, look, let's be honest, because that's what we do here. Yeah. Every coach in America could have gotten nabbed for that, or at least an overwhelming majority of them.
And remember, he was suspended for their East Carolina game last year to open the season. So ultimately these are complicated things, and there's a ton of legalese that goes into them. But like I've done this for long enough where like the listener cares what's going to happen, right? Let's funnel this very complicated, jargon-filled notice into like what is going to happen. So the qualifier here is that it is a jury of their peers, right? This is up to the Committee on Infractions. It's not the NCAA. It's not Charlie Baker. It's Committee on Infractions. I actually spent some time with the Committee on Infractions for a story in the spring. So you're like, who is it? It's, and I'm just going to name these arbitrarily. Like there's more than a dozen people, but it's the AD at Toledo, the Associate Commissioner or Deputy Commissioner of the Big East. It's the President of Colorado State. It's Associate Commissioners at mid-major leagues. It is a Star Wars bar of just random college athletic officials.
Wait, let's time stamp that. Pete made a pop culture reference.
Yes.
Please continue.
From the 80s, so that's about where I'm caught up to. When I was Teddy's age, I actually had some pop culture in me.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. Well-deserved. Yeah. Please, barb away. So the Committee on Infractions ultimately is going to have to come up with a decision. Remember, they did push back against Michigan last year when they tried to negotiate a resolution. They said, no. They basically didn't think Jim Harbaugh was going to get punished enough, and they thought him lying, misleading, whatever he did, whatever jargon you want to use for his obstinance towards this process, which has continued since he went to the NFL. They said, no, that's not enough, and they kind of had to table that. So Moore is ultimately, his fate is going to go there. As a level 2, I would think ultimately that gets distilled to a short suspension of some kind. That is, it could be no suspension. It could be a short suspension. I don't think we're looking at anything. It's hard, if you look at what happened in like the college basketball scandal, it's hard to have a like significant. You've really got to like break some rules to do that. He obviously allegedly deleted a thread of 52 text messages. It does later say he turned them over. If the text messages had like, "Hey Connor, what's Ohio State's run sign?" or whatever, like it would probably be noted in here, and it's not. So I think that he's in here for the act of failing to cooperate, basically. And then eventually he did. And you can read through the lines here and say, seemingly there was no giant smoking gun, or they would have noted the smoking gun. And there would have been a level 1. The other 4 coaches who are gone, who are accused of failing to cooperate, have level 1s. So that nuance makes me think, if you're going to read the tea leaves for what this independent Star Wars bar is going to decide, it would come down to likely some type of short suspension. But as we've said for the years, Rece, the NCAA, they kind of make it up as they like. There's no like they point you to this penalty matrix, but the cases never follow the penalty matrix. So it's really hard to do that. So that's track 1 here, and then track 2 here that I think the fans want to know, like the people on Twitter have reacted to, is will there be a postseason ban?
No.
Correct. That's basically like,
and there's going to be no vacating of anything.
Correct. That is 1,000%.
I'm not going to pretend that they didn't win it.
So the vacating thing, I can say with full-throated confidence, because that would involve, they take away wins when it involves when it involves players who aren't eligible.
Yeah.
And there are no players implicated in here directly by name or anything. So that looking back, there will be nothing. Looking forward, you could say technically some type of postseason ban is on the table. The actual likelihood of that happening, considering Tennessee, considering the political climate, considering the NCAA has basically come out and said we don't want to punish teams. Like I would, and again, I called a bunch of people who traffic in this world, and they were all like, we'd be shocked, we'd be shocked, we'd be shocked. So again, it comes down to a room full of people and how they react. So you can never 100% predict it, but I would say looking at this, it would seem unlikely. What is likely is Michigan cuts a big old check.
Well, and you know what? That is what the punishments should be, in my judgment. I've said this for years. What drives this enterprise? Money. What sends the biggest message? Taking away money. So if the NCAA wants to be taken seriously, consistently as an enforcement body for college sports and college football particularly, that needs to be the direction in which they go. Find people. They can do the show cause thing. I do have a question about the show cause. In theory, if they wanted to try to embarrass Sharon Moore because he didn't cooperate, which that makes them, ask Bruce Pearl, that makes them the maddest of anything, is if they believe you aren't cooperating with them, more so than what you may or may not have done. If they want to make an example of cooperation, they could give him a show cause, which in theory could expire while he's still the head coach at Michigan and really be of no effect. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I'm skeptical. The show cause is on the table. It says it in the document.
Okay, but
so
in theory, I'm saying in theory, they could give him a 1 year.
Yeah.
They could give him a 1 year show cause. He's a head coach at Michigan.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter, and then it expires and never
some
matters
of your
again.
recruiting. That's like what the nuts and bolts of it are. The show cause used to be a mighty penalty because as an institution, back when the NCAA had more gravitas, people would be embarrassed. Presidents would be embarrassed. And like now, just as we've gone through, you mentioned Bruce Pearl.
Hired some guys to show causes.
Correct. Yeah. Like as we've gone through this, like the institutions have basically said the NCAA punishments don't matter.
Right.
So we're at the point where the show cause isn't what it used to be. It would be fairly significant, I think, reputationally, Rece, when we look at this. Like, this doesn't look great for Michigan, right? Like, you have, it as an institution.
It says there was an atmosphere of noncompliance.
Right? Yes, noncompliance.
Or pattern or whatever.
I'll be curious about this. Like we've talked about when we first heard that Stalions was doing a Netflix thing. You were like, "Well, I don't think we said this on the air, but we were on the phone." You're like, "Well, I'm gonna watch it the first night." Like, and we're all fascinated by it, right? Like it's it consumed the season last year for a large portion of it in many ways, and it crossed into pop culture, right? Like. My wife, your wife probably thought like we're very curious about Connor Stalions. So how do you think he gets presented in this? Do they present him as a hero? Like it's an interesting, like he's in this interesting space.
They'll present him prediction, no insight. But prediction, they will present him as a driven guy, smart, trying to come from nowhere to make his mark for his ultimate dream of being the head coach at Michigan. Because he had the big manifesto, his plan to do it. Hey, ambition's a good thing. Yeah. I mean, I don't begrudge him for that, but he clearly broke the rules. Now, here's the question that Michigan fans, and look, the only people who say that this was the only reason they won are either Ohio State fans or people who don't like Michigan. They're the only ones. But the only people who say it didn't matter at all are Michigan fans wearing maize and blue glasses. Yeah. Now, we will never know to what extent, what advantage they got by having the signals. And I am a staunch believer in this. If someone steals your signals and you become aware of it, which would be almost impossible at this level of football to not realize Michigan's a step ahead of us. They know our signs. If they've got your signals, change your signals. Get better ones. Use a new decoy. Use a different board. Do something. Don't just sit there and do it. And I would rather suspect that happened a few times. They suspected Michigan had it. They changed them. Whatever. We'll never know how big an advantage. It was an advantage. And the most important thing is whether you think it should be against the rules to scout in person ahead of time or not. It is. And as I said the morning it happened, if this is true, and it certainly appears from all of this that it was, they broke the rules. They cheated. To what extent? We'll never know that. Does it mean they should take the banner down? No. Does it tarnish the championship in my judgment? No. It's an embarrassing thing. They were the best team. They won the national championship. They earned it. They deserved it. I know Charlie Baker went with the fair and square route. You might take issue with that, because they certainly at least had the perception of gaining some advantage.
I think Charlie's context there was like the playoff was fair.
The playoff was fair.
And square. Yeah. I don't think he exonerated Michigan. I think
no.
That's one of those like half a sentences. That's probably been his most famous quote as NCAA president. The most like noted and quoted.
I do think this, though, Pete. Mm-hmm. What you have out of this is, and not that he would want to, but you've got three guys who are going to come out of this, at least maybe four. Three guys who are not going to coach in college again. Jim Harbaugh, Charlie Partridge, and obviously Connor Stalions, maybe Denard Robinson. We don't know. Denard might be able to get past this long term. Mentor and Clinkscale, Jesse Mentor, Steve Clinkscale, if they were to ever choose to go back, they're going to be able to go back to college.
Those were your basic run-of-the-mill recruiting stuff.
That was nothing.
That's not going to slow them down.
But you're going to have three guys who aren't going to coach in college again. Jim, for a number of reasons. Mm-hmm. One, because he's going to stay in the NFL. If it doesn't work out with the Chargers, there will be someone else. And, at some point, Jim's going to say, I've accomplished what I would set out to accomplish in college. Here's the NFL. He either will or he won't. That will be a combination of probably show cause, baggage, dealing with Jim personally, who I like, but dealing with him, and the fact that he's not going to want to do it. So, this is of no consequence to him. But the one thing I wanted to read this.
Yeah.
The response from Jim Harbaugh at the mic the day this came out was the most Harbaugh quote that ever Harbaugh'd. I mean, if you love Jim Harbaugh, drink the whole milk, push up the glasses, whole thing, this is it. Here's what Harbaugh said, and I quote, "Never lie, never cheat, never steal. I was raised with that lesson. I raised my family on that lesson. And I preach that lesson to the teams I've coached. No one's perfect. If you stumble, you apologize and you make it right." And now here's where the entire world who doesn't know Jim Harbaugh expected mistakes might have been made, blah, blah, blah. Instead, Harbaugh said, as I continue the quote, "Today, I do not apologize. I did not participate. I was not aware nor complicit in these said allegations, so it's back to work and attacking with an enthusiasm unknown to mankind." End quote.
Yes.
It was fabulous.
Yes, I would say
it was sensational.
I would say
Harbaugh
it's a
was great.
distinctly different tenor than January 9th when he said the off-field issues were innocent. We stood strong and tall because we knew we were innocent. That is not what he said at Charger practice the other day. And I do think, Rece, reading through this, to me, as somebody who obviously covered it closely at week by week last fall.
Oh, no, you did? Oh,
yeah, no, I know.
I didn't notice.
So, Rece, I think the most interesting piece of this is the specificity of the scope that the NCAA lays out. I've read a lot of these notice allegations in the last 20 years. And again, this is only a draft. But it's very clear that Connor Stalions left behind. His Naval Academy professors couldn't be too pleased with his covert nature in this. So they list 58 instances of off-campus in-person scouting, 13 different opponents in 53 contests over 3 years. So to, like you said, the crowd of, they didn't gain an advantage. If you illegally tape the signals in person of 53 games, catalog them, distill them, they mention hand signal sheets for different opponents. Like, it sort of illuminates like the scope and breadth of the scheme. And it will be interesting to see, again, like how he is cast in this Netflix thing, because you can tell, I've never seen the NCAA have so much specificity on someone in something like this. Like, they go on to list Google Drive, spreadsheet, calendars, password protective hard drives. There isn't just like some assistant SID whispered this to us. They go over and over to really show like the breadth and scope, and you can understand better now because they knew all this. Remember, this is a weird NCAA case, and they've never seen one like this. At some point this fall, the NCAA was basically given all this evidence by someone whose speculation for a while was there were all these boogeyman things, but it clearly came from somebody inside the Michigan program, right? You don't have the access to this stuff. And again, that's speculation, but like you can't find that, the breadth of this information. And so when the NCAA got that and alerted Tony Petitti, and you were given this, 53 games, you can't sit there and say like, oh, maybe. No, like this is as definitive of a case as I've seen come through the Committee on Infractions in the last 2 decades. So it's just it will be really interesting to see like moving forward how Stalions is viewed. I think the Netflix thing reputationally is going to be a crossroads for him, right? Because nobody really knows what to think. He's just, there's maybe not been a more compelling character in college football maybe since like Johnny Manziel. I mean, he has been like a once a decade, like wow kind of character, right? You couldn't make it up. He's like the super fan who makes his way in. There's like part of it is a Disney movie, and then part of it is like I don't even know. I can't even make the pop culture reference to the other type of movies because, as you know, I don't know anything about pop culture, but. It's just this like really weird case, but at least like I found reading through it, I was like, oh, okay, like they really had him. That's why. Like, why did Tony Petitti publicly call out Michigan, which we pointed out at the time? Like that doesn't happen. Like the SEC doesn't just like publicly call out Alabama for being under investigation. It just like doesn't happen. Now it's like, okay, they were handed all of this information basically. So
had no choice.
Yeah, no, they had no choice. Yeah. And they were going to play Michigan State that weekend, and they felt like it wasn't a fair competitive advantage. The one thing that's missing from here that I think is really interesting is who funded this, right? Like there's mileage, there's tickets, there's you buy tickets to 53 college football games. Like that, like this was not something on, I think Connor Stalions made like 50 grand if I remember right, looking it up last year from like the Public Michigan website. So like that's not like the capability to do that wasn't there. So where I think that is sort of part of the interesting thing, and I think obviously important to point out, like there's no direct link to Jim Harbaugh. There's one football staff member mentioned here. They don't mention that person by name. I would insinuate that was not a on-field full-time coaching staff member.
And there's nothing in this draft of allegations to suggest that Stalions misappropriated expense reports or anything like that.
Correct.
To pay for it. Nothing in there to suggest that. Right.
No, there's no mention of payment actually, which is interesting because like if the NCAA was going to advance what was handed to them, that would have been one of the places where maybe they could have gone and done some legwork. So this is actually, I know it seems like forever for our listeners, this is actually like a fairly quick turn for how the NCAA infractions process works.
Which brings us up, if there is indeed a game suspension, which I don't think there's going to be for Sharon Moore, but if there is, it'll probably be one game. Will they turn it this year, or will it be the opening game of the 25 season?
I mean, it would have to be a negotiated resolution to turn this year, and there's skepticism from the people who work in this world that there would be one. Yeah. So I think it'll drag. I think the next step in this case, Rece, is how much does Michigan just own it, and how much do they fight it? Mm-hmm. Because look, it's a place. This is damaging to Michigan reputationally. I don't think you can argue that. When you have your school with a level 1, your former head coach, with a level 1, and the language in here, it's like reckless indifference to NCAA rules. I mean, that was for Stalions, but there's reputationally, Michigan can either just like lay down and work with them and probably get to an end quicker, or they can push back on things. Really, the only thing I can see them pushing back on is Sharon Moore because they don't really care about the other stuff. Yeah. Right? Like you don't care about Jim Harbaugh getting a 3-year show cause or a 5-year show cause or whatever it may be. So that is really the one thing that's in the crosshairs. And obviously, if they hinted at some type of postseason ban, they would push back with a lot of vigor on that. But I just think if you remember the Tennessee case, my understanding of it was I think $11 million they came up with was what their postseason payout would be from the SEC. I don't know off the top of my head what that is for the Big Ten next year with everything changes. I don't know if it'll be this year, next year with the playoff. That number gets a lot bigger, quite frankly, when the playoff expands. But I think it'll be like a bit of an eye-popping number. And I know Michigan prints money and has $1 billion endowment and has one of the richest athletic parts of the country. It's still a big check. Like that's it's still like
nobody likes to give away money for nothing.
Correct, especially millions. I don't care how rich you are. Stephen Ross, that would hurt him, and he's a pretty rich guy.
I'm going to split hairs with you on one thing. I think it will hurt Michigan reputationally, but only in certain quarters that the aristocracy of college sports care about. Rank and file fans,
no question,
hurt them at all.
Yeah,
do not care. Not even a little bit, because they sort of assume everybody's doing it. They especially assume that teams they don't like will be doing it. And deep in their soul, they know that the team that they do like is also doing it. Maybe not Connor Stalions stuff, but I'm talking about things that are outside the rule.
And Rece, I agree. The rank and file, this doesn't do much. I do think Michigan's higher ground and the aura of Michigan man, they should anyway cede some of that a little bit here, because you can't lord over some of your rivals with your aura of superiority ethically with the way this is laid out. Does that actually mean anything? No, not really. But there is an easy rebuttal to all their rivals now that they have that the NCAA has given them here with the volume of evidence of what happened with Stalions, and then other sort of, including the last case, other just sort of like minor recruiting scraps and such that have accumulated here.
That's a fair point. No one has the market cornered on irrational, obnoxious fans, and no one has the market cornered on a section of the fan base that believes they have some type of unearned moral superiority. But One could say that the whole Michigan man mantra that they try really hard, but no one has cornered the market in that regard. So I would agree. Stepping back on that would be wise. Last thing on this, Pete, and I have the utmost respect for all of our colleagues here at ESPN who do such wonderful work. And there were a number of shows over the last few days showed the video of Connor Stalions on the sideline in Central Michigan State game wearing his Halloween mustache and glasses despised for
maybe camera glasses.
Yeah,
they didn't confirm they were camera glasses. That was one of the great rabbit holes of this whole ordeal.
Well, those of a certain age would refer to those as Groucho Marx glasses, the legendary comedian. And everybody said, I knew in 11 seconds that was Connor Stalions. Why did it take the NCAA all this time to confirm that? Well, fair enough, man. But you missed the bigger point. With Connor Stalions, that shot that everybody's seeing in there, the camera keeps going back and forth. And who's there with him? Jim McElwain, the head coach at Central Michigan, who once was a Michigan staffer. But that's not the point. The point is now that sort of by happenstance, perhaps, Jim McElwain has been connected with two of the weirdest little pieces of video in the last 10 years of college football. Because if you remember, I think it was 7 years ago, a video or a photo went viral of Jim McElwain's doppelganger naked on a boat with a shark. And rather than laugh this off, because McElwain has a great sense of humor, he got angry about this, probably because he was under heat at Florida. But he was connected to this naked guy lying on a boat with a shark that had been brought into the boat, having to insist it wasn't him. And for the record to point, it was not him. It was not him. It looked like Jim, but it wasn't. And now you have him caught in the crossfire of a camera getting the Groucho Marx guy, Connor Stalions, on his sideline with a pass that nobody knows how he got, but perhaps
Can we predict that when Central Michigan's time with the NCAA ends here, there will be a trope of the NCAA was so mad at Michigan they put Central Michigan on probation?
Yeah, exactly. Well, Tarkanian used to say that about Kentucky, right? You're so mad at Kentucky basketball they put Cleveland State on probation.
There's some embers of that maybe potentially emerging as a storyline here.
Let's go on the field, and we might as well start with Michigan. What we're doing here, a group of 12 teams who we believe could make the playoff. Not favored, not predicted by us at the moment. Wouldn't take a lot. And how we're going to do this, we're going to give you a team, a reason to believe, question that has to be answered, and what we think is going to happen. So we both have Michigan somewhere in this group of 12. I'll start with Michigan. I have them 14, 15, not precise numbers here. Reason to believe, proven playmaking cornerstones. They literally have the best cornerback in college football, Will Johnson, who I believe is the highest rated player on College Football 25. Donovan Edwards, missing in action until the national championship game. Mason Graham. Those are reasons to believe in Michigan.
Yes, and I would double down on Mason Graham and mention Kenneth Grant, who actually is just such a freakazoid. He's their nose tackle from Indiana, 6'3", 399. He ran down, I believe it was Katron Allen from Penn State, from behind. In a play last year that Jim Harbaugh had some great quotes about. So they have, and I'll throw Colston Loveland in that group.
Terrific.
They have, some top flight players. Reason to believe D-line would be my first one. You don't have two interior defensive linemen like that. And Wink Martindale hasn't been in college, but he's an old hand. And you can really dominate a defense if you have half the field shut down from Will Johnson and you have that type of pressure up the middle, because you have a lot of toys to play with, because you're not going to have to rush more than four very many times. So ton of reason to believe in Michigan, but it starts in the trenches on defense for me, Rece.
Biggest question to answer is obvious. Quarterback. They've got a room full of quarterbacks, and only one of them has attempted more than 15 passes in college, and the guy that many of us believe will ultimately be the quarterback, Alex Orji, I believe has thrown one pass in college and didn't throw one last year, one drop back. Terrific athlete, strong arm. I mean, that's the obvious when you have to have a quarterback.
Correct. I will say the identity of this program, as they've gone on this 50-3 run the past 3 years, has been the offensive line. The identity was not the quarterback; it was the offensive line. They won games by dominating up front. I believe they had 3 players drafted last year. They had 18 players go to the combine. The O-line, though, was Michigan's definitive identity that led to their numbing efficiency. And Miles Hinton has started a handful of games, but they just bring in 5 giant question marks on that O-line. So I'm not going to be convicted in my belief in Michigan until I see that line come together. Now, Sharon Moore was an elite offensive line coach the past couple of years, produced elite offensive lines, both as the O-line coach and then as the OC, where he also coached O-line. They moved Grant Newsome over from tight end coach for this group. They have to grow up quickly with Texas coming in week 2. But my skepticism is rooted there. If you have a new quarterback and there's questions about the kind of holes you can open for your run game and how you protect him, and then how you go about winning and operating games. I just feel like that is why I don't have Michigan as a playoff team right now, because I don't see the path like I saw the path the last year.
I agree. That's what happens. I think the overall transition, not just coaching, but personnel, quarterback, coaching, all this outside noise stuff, a little too much. I'm expecting an 8-4 type of season for Michigan, but schedule enough, because we're talking, if you look at the 4 games, got Texas and USC in September. They've got Oregon, that's also at home. They go to Ohio State. If they could lose those games, maybe drop another one along the way. Anything better than that, I think, is a really successful season, and anything better than that will at least have them under evaluation come selection day. If they can be competitive in every game, 9-3, even 10-2, they'll be in that mix. I expect them to be closer to 8-4.
Yeah, they're an interesting test case for, again, they didn't play a tough out-of-conference game the last 2 years, and probably the last 3. I don't honestly remember. It was 3. But the last 2 it was East Carolina and UNLV and Bowling Green and those types of schools. So now we have this whole new group in the playoff. How do you evaluate an early loss to Texas if you're a 3-loss team, right? If you challenge yourself by playing Texas, that should be rewarded, right? We don't root for anybody, but we root for good games, right?
Yeah.
We need good games. And that is the kind of monster game I don't feel like the sport can afford to lose in a lot of ways. So it will be really interesting to see. Clemson, Georgia, there's a bunch of these early. Miami, Florida. Look at Florida's out-of-conference schedule. How does the committee treat those losses, and do they punish teams for playing those games and losing them, as opposed to just inviting in a direction of Minnesota to Eastern Washington or whatever to beat by 50 and send home?
It's one of the things that I talked about this morning with our producer, Jim Galliero, about one of the things we really need to point out with the expansion of these conferences is there is some merit to saying they play a Big Ten schedule or they play an SEC schedule, but there is significant variance within those schedules, and it is incumbent on the committee to really parse through which of these teams that they played. Now, it is fair to say, okay, the 12th place team in the SEC or the Big Ten, might be 2 games under 500 there. Maybe they're a game or 2 over 500 in the ACC, but that is part of the subjective evaluation, just to use that as an example. Maybe they wouldn't be, but that's how they should be parsing it, rather than saying they went 6-2 in the SEC or they went 6-3 in the Big Ten. They don't need to do it that way. They need to look at the individual schedule, which brings me to the next team from the Big Ten on my list that I think, with a couple of things going right, could get in the mix. And this might surprise you. Iowa. The reason to believe, and I'm the one that always says, if you're not good enough, a loss will find you. And that applies to Iowa. That said, the reason to believe is the schedule. They miss Michigan, they miss Oregon, they miss Penn State. They do have to go to Ohio State. Everything else on their schedule is very, very favorable.
I agree, and I just think that bringing in Tim Lester as the offensive coordinator, remember he was in Green Bay last year. I want to say that Matt LaFleur played for him at some point. There's a deep connection to both LaFleurs in there. So he knows that sort of Shanahan offense, the offense that's the rage in the NFL and isn't, quite frankly, really run in college very much. So, again, I think they were 130th last year. I didn't look it up, but that's been a pretty safe bet to be where they were offensively. You might have it in your...
Which leads to the question, and you're dovetailing beautifully into the question. They didn't score. in their last 2 games. They scored 20 offensive touchdowns in 14 games last year.
Yeah. So if all of a sudden you can go from 130th to 90th, which is generally bad on offense, right? If you can go from just abysmal and historically inept to just simply below average, it could really, again, the way Kirk plays, like holding the ball and running the clock and controlling the game is such a big part of it. If they could do that with, we're assuming Cade McNamara, Brendan Sullivan's a good player. He was a really important piece at Northwestern last year to keep that thing together. But with Cade McNamara, if he's upright and healthy, and a better offensive line, one thing Kirk Ferentz told me at Media Days was this is their best offensive line. He said the last 3 years, the offensive line just hadn't been what it had been at Iowa. And for a decade, it had been as staunch as possible. And you almost look back on Brian Ferentz saying him going away from the line to be the OC, to coach the quarterbacks, hurt them double. Because obviously the quarterbacks weren't developing, the throw game was non-existent, and then the line, which had been his baby for a long time, started to atrophy at a certain point. So the thought is collectively as those things go, the one thing I was told to look for, talking to people at Iowa, is there will be a lot of pre-snap motion. I believe one of the advanced metrics had Iowa last in the country.
I was going to say, do they know that that's not against the rules
so
at Iowa?
The Shanahan stuff, if you watch the Niners and you watch the Packers, it's a ton of it, Rece. A ton of it. And I was told that the headset communication is really key in sort of lining that stuff up and finding gaps and moving things around. So again, I always say it's July, it's media day season. There's a case for everybody, right? You can make a case for everyone. The case for Iowa is that Tim Lesser, a veteran, old hand, head coach at Western Michigan. He's been on offensive staffs at Syracuse and Purdue. He's been a lower level head coach. Guy's seen a lot of football, and he's spent a year in the NFL learning the system. If he can come in and deliver some baseline competency and them moving the ball, I really think it gives them a chance. You want to hear a great stat before we go?
Let's hear it.
Remember that awful, maybe the worst Iowa game in this stretch was that South Dakota State game? South Dakota State has not lost since that game. 29 straight. Yeah, obviously that we looked that up with Oklahoma State. I just thought that was amusing. I'm doing a story on South Dakota State's quarterback, and he called that the worst offensive game in the history of college football. I'm paraphrasing there, but it was.
I don't know did he see the what was the scoreless tie at the end of regulation between Virginia Tech and Wake Forest?
Yes,
I forgot what year that was.
Frank Beamer with his arms. Yes.
Beamer holding up the 0-0. That was certainly right in there. So what I think happens with Iowa is, I'll reiterate, schedule's great. If you're not good enough, a loss will find you. If they only lose to Ohio State, high likelihood that they will be in the Big Ten championship game. Remember, no divisions in the Big Ten anymore. Another loss finds them somewhere along the way. They're very much improved. Don't make the Big Ten championship game and don't make the playoff. But they look much better because they're better on offense.
Got to win Cy-Hawk with that schedule.
Well, okay, since you brought up Cy-Hawk, I was going to go a different direction. I will go to Iowa State. Iowa State is also in this group with me that if they need a thing or two to go their way, they're close. The reason to believe their young quarterback, Rocco Beck, broke a bunch of Brock Purdy's freshman records. They've got playmakers, both at running back and receiver. They return a bunch of these guys are one of the most experienced teams in the country. In fact, they lead the nation in returning production by some calculations. That's the reason to believe in the Cyclones.
Yes, and Matt Campbell didn't just get dumb because they struggled the last 2 years. He generally knows what he's doing. They have had some coaching staff change there. I am a believer in Rocco Becht. If you look at the way he evolved through last season, Campbell told us a great story in Vegas, natural site for Big 12 Media Day, that they played at Ohio last year. Remember, they lost. And he said Becht woke up sick as a dog that day. And just a lot of guys, they had something going through the team. A lot of guys didn't play, whatever. And he kind of fought through it, played well in the second half. They didn't quite come back and win. But that was the day where everybody in the program rallied around him. Because remember, Hunter Dekkers was supposed to be their starter last year. They had that weird gambling scandal that now looks like a massive sort of unfortunate overreach by some mall cops in the gambling
Paul
commission
Blart.
in Iowa.
Call me back, Paul Blart.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, he gets thrust in this role, has to develop and grow. And I think when we look back on last year and some of his early struggles and his growth, we're gonna be like, wow, what a great runway to launch a career. They don't flinch when they say like there's some comparables between Rocco Beck and Brock Purdy. Everybody in the NFL remembers Brock Purdy as the last pick in the draft. People Iowa State remember him as the guy who went and won them the Fiesta Bowl against Oregon.
Mm-hmm. Elevated them. Running back Abu Sama led the nation in yards after contact last year. But here's the question they have to answer, and it's quite simple. They're 1-6 in games decided by 4 points or fewer the last 3 seasons. They've lost 13 of their last 16 one-score games. Sooner or later, that's not an accident. They have to find a way to finish, have to find a way to make the play to win the game. That's the question. What I think happens with Iowa State is that they lose too many close games to make the playoff. Have a good season.
Yeah.
Going to be kind of just on that next tier of teams. But until I see it, I'm going to need to see them win some close games before I believe they can.
Yeah, and I do think they are going to be capable of delivering, a game or two this year where you're like, oh wow, they're going to go to, they're going to go win at Utah, like where maybe they weren't favored, because they're the type of program that's done that. They're built on toughness. There's still really good fundamentals there. That the talent dipped, and it feels like the talent's back. The only player who left North Dakota State of significant note last year was a receiver named Eli Green, who went down there, and they expect big things out of him. He was very productive at North Dakota State.
A lot of teams in the Big 12 in this category, because I think you can make a case that the Big 12 might be, people use the word depth, this might be the widest league, meaning that there aren't as many teams with this high ceiling, but there aren't that many teams with low floors. There are teams that are very similar. And I think that Oklahoma State and Iowa State are somewhat similar in that regard. Reason to believe in the Cowpokes. Ollie Gordon and a ton of returning production and experience on the offensive line. They've got 8 guys who at one point in their careers have been full-time Power 5 starters, over 200 career starts up front. So
are they the new Florida State Rece?
That is where, I don't know. That's where it starts. If you believe that Oklahoma State can win the Big 12 and get in the playoff, that's where it starts.
Yeah, at 20 returning starters. Again, remember, they got just rammed by South Alabama at home last year. I think part of this was Mike Gundy swallowing his ego and getting his kid out of the quarterback competition, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. They gave the ball to Alan Bowman full time. Soon after, things took off from there. I believe they won 8 out of 10 to close the season. Gunnar Gundy is at Emporia State, so water found its level probably a little bit there. And I really feel like they've done a good job keeping that core together. And look, defensively, they're really good. Now, didn't they have that one game last year? Didn't they go to UCF and just get like
45-3?
Yeah, just woodshedded like randomly. So again, that sits in the back of your mind when you're like, oh, you need to be in the Big 12. You don't have a lot of room for error still. It's still you don't have to go undefeated, but it's still a little bit like the college football we remember, where you're chasing darn near perfection. You have said you think only one Big 12 team makes the playoff. I've not been I can see that happening. I'm not skeptical of that, but I think they may find a way to get 2. But the one thing that would prevent them from doing that is everything, like you said, is so even, Rece, that these guys are going to knock each other off.
I suspect, and we'll get to it when we make our playoff predictions, that the Big 12 champion probably has 3 losses overall, and three losses and 4th seed.
Yes,
because they would be the next highest ranked champion. So the question that they have to answer, you mentioned they gave the ball to Bowman and it took off. One of the problems they had last year was that Bowman gave the ball to the defense too often. He had 14 interceptions. Got to clean that up. They were outgained in Big 12 play by an average of about 17 yards per game. So they won some close games. Mm-hmm. What happens? I think they make it to the college football, to the Big 12 championship game with a chance to get there, but I'm not predicting them to go to the playoff.
Yeah, I don't think they're going to make the playoff either.
Okay.
Watch out for the old Jackrabbits week 1, by the way.
Yep. Well, that could change things and change perception of contenders in the Big 12. Yet another Big 12 team. I know a team you love. Kansas State, and the reason to believe is your man crush of the year.
He might be my man crush. Yeah, I like a good mullet. You got to give me a good mullet, flapping in the breeze as he sprints down. I had a scout see him at some point last year and say he's Anthony Richardson, and I was like, huh? And he's like, he's Anthony Richardson, and I was like, wow, that's a bold call, for a backup K-State quarterback, who ended up winning the job. And Chris Kleiman was very blunt with me at Big 12 Media Days. He said, when Will Howard came in and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about going to the portal or going pro," he said, "You know what? Avery's gonna be our starter." So like they knew what they had. He could be a folk hero, Rece. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like local kid from Wichita. I just think there's a ton of talent there. He's also like not the biggest guy in the world, so like how much do you run him becomes a really interesting question for Connor Riley, the new OC there. Colin Klein obviously went to Texas A&M, but I'm gonna stay bullish on them. And look, like Chris Kleiman is not a guy I'm gonna bet against a ton. He's a little bit like Lance Leipold, right? Yep. Those guys have won so much everywhere they've gone. It's just easy to believe.
Question they have to answer is protecting Avery Johnson. They'll have to do better there. They had 4 road losses last year by a touchdown or less. So they've got to answer that. I think that they will be in contention for the Big 12 championship game. I think that's how it goes for them, but not picking them to win it either.
Yeah, that Arizona game, it's one of those first big Friday games on our on a differing cable network.
And does not count in the conference standings.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And I think we might have talked about this from Big 12 Media Day. I just feel like that could end up being one of those like playoff argument things going against them if they're trying to get that second school. Hey, that's not even a conference game. That's an unforced error by the. Now they had no control of it, but that's an unforced error.
Yeah. So I have Arizona in this group as well from the Big 12. The reason to believe in the Wildcats, even with the new head coaching change to Brent Brennan coming from San Jose State. I hope I'm not being hyperbolic here. I think they have the best returning pass-catch combination in college football, Noah Fafita and Teteroa McMillan.
No, it was interesting. Teteroa McMillan was at Big 12 Media Day, and he looks like an NFL receiver. He is a dude, man. He walks in and he fills up the room. Noah Fafita looks like a left halfback for the U.S. national soccer team. He's an athlete, and he's a good-looking athlete, but he's like a stocky. You could see why he put up all those crazy numbers in high school, and the USC's and Oregon's didn't recruit him, right? Because he is, I don't measure him or anything like that, but he is distinctly shorter than my 5'11". So it's interesting to see that Arizona and give Jed Fish a lot of credit, right? Everybody on the West Coast wanted McMillan. They were high school teammates, and they're clearly good friends. All the Arizona contingent at Big 12 Media Day was wearing leis. I believe it was McMillan's mother who gave them. So Brent Brennan was walking around wearing like a very elaborate lei. It was very cool. He said, when a Samoan mother gives you a lei, you wear the lei. I said, okay. No argument to no argument to that. But yeah, they are as exciting, and I like. Again, the other pieces there, they have a really good corner who's like a top 50 NFL prospect, Davis. But like the other pieces there, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like it's like modern. It's the Aranda principle there a little bit too, right? There's still 30 new guys. They had some dudes leave. They had some dudes come back. Like so, I think it's hard to have conviction to say Arizona's a playoff team, but I have conviction to saying wouldn't be surprised they go to Manhattan, light it up. Those two get hot. McMillan is probably going to be the first receiver. He or Luther Burden are going to be the first receiver picked in the draft.
Tacario Davis that you mentioned, yes. 15 passes broken up last year, but the schedule makers did them no favors. A lot of tough road games. I think the transition and the schedule, that's the question they have to answer. And I think ultimately they don't quite make the Big 12 championship game, so they're just on the outside of the playoff. So that's a ton of Big 12 teams that we've looked at and still haven't exhausted the supply.
Yeah.
The preseason favorite, the newest team, do you have Utah in the playoff or do you have them contending for the playoff?
I have them in the playoff.
Okay.
Yeah. If there's any conference champion I'm convicted about in the preseason, I think it's Utah. It's, Death Taxes and Kyle Whittingham. The way they win is not going to change. I actually heard this point on Cole Kubelik's podcast this weekend. I'm gonna crib it. The one thing about Utah that's interesting is they haven't had a ton of bowl success. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's a little bit of like they've had success in the Pac-12 and they've done it, but like on the big stages, they did beat Florida last year early in the season. That didn't end up being like a transformational victory or anything. But there is a little bit of like, okay, how will they translate? It took them a little while to translate to the Pac-12. I don't see that happening. I think this is one of their better defenses that they've had there, which is saying something because that thing's obviously been built on there. Again, Cam Rising's health is the variable. I don't think there's much behind him, as there wasn't last year, as we saw the pass game, struggle. One guy who I think is really going to emerge as a superstar nationally this year is Lander Barton. He's a guy that the NFL teams have quietly really liked and put a high grade on early in the season. He's their linebacker who's just kind of their all everything. It's interesting. A lot of their defensive players, Rece, were offensive players in high school, and they just got there as good athletes, and they have been molded into the typical stormtroopers we're used to seeing stop opposing ball carriers and passers at Utah.
Well, let's keep Utah abbreviated, foreshadowing, because you've got them in the playoff. And so we will also keep, I'm really giving things away. Let's also keep Kansas abbreviated.
Oh, who likes them?
Reason to believe in Kansas is Lance Leipold and Jalen Daniels healthy at quarterback. I'll often offer some caveats, perhaps, once we get to the playoff section. Devin Neal's back. Daniel Highshaw's back. They've got a lot of weapons there.
Is Jared Casey still there?
He is.
Oh,
he
man.
is.
He must be in his ninth year of eligibility. I think he caught passes from Todd Rece.
And they've got over 100 starts on the offensive line. So give me quick synopsis on Kansas, because I get the feeling we're going to debate them in the final 12.
We can. I don't want to. This is too good to use here, but I'm going to use it anyway. Jalen Daniels told me that he's gotten into yoga to help his back, and he said half pigeon is the best pose to relieve back pain. If you've done any yoga in your day, half pigeon is just a delightful place to be. So namaste, Jalen.
Another team, ACC, Miami. Reason to believe in Miami is talent. The transfers, Cam Ward, Damian Martinez, Xavier Restrepo at offensive line, over 100 starts. They didn't blow blocks last year, one of the lowest blown block rates in the country last year. That's the reason to believe in Miami. Where do you stand there?
So I believe a little more than you, Rece, if we're going to foreshadow some. And I believe in...
We're keeping them abbreviated, too?
We're going to keep them abbreviated, too.
All right.
I believe in Samuel Brown. I know the NFL does. I believe in talent accumulation, and nobody has done it better.
Okay. Lost one possession games last year, 1-4. And I will say this, the question they have to answer, and that I will bring up again when you bring them up, is they have to avoid stepping on the rake. And they have stepped on a lot of rakes and smashed their noses in.
That was a nuclear rake last year.
Yeah, that was, well, it wasn't the only one. There were several of them.
No, fair.
Here is another team, Tennessee. Reason to believe best pass rusher in college football, and James Pierce Jr. had 10 sacks last year to lead the SEC. Believe in the Vols.
Not at the highest levels. Their secondary has me a little bit scared. They lost a starter just yesterday.
Jordan Thomas, hurt now for the season. This in addition to they lost 11 DBs either to the pros or to the portal last year. And they were already suspect back
Correct.
there.
And if they were anything on defense, they were thin, especially there already. So, it feels like an old Big 12 team that Josh Heupel's got a little bit there, because they're going to go. Brew McCoy has been in college since the Nixon administration. He's their big senior receiver. He's obviously had some injury issues and some other off-field stuff that slowed him early in his career. I believe in the skill. I believe Nico fits the system. I just think there's a few too many variables on the defensive side of the ball for any conviction.
I've had to relearn, because I love to study the pronunciation guide, and I feel like I learned it slightly in error. So I'm having to retrain myself on Nico's last name.
Let's go.
Nico Iamaleava, as opposed to the way I read it, and the way I learned it when I read it was Maleava, but I believe they prefer Maleava at the end.
Nico Iamaleava.
Amaleava. Yeah, I learned it with a little bit of extra emphasis on the Male.
Okay.
Get to know him.
There's no doubt about that. And his brother just committed to Deshaun Foster at UCLA. So that is you teach a man to fish. There's going to be a lot of Amaleavas being talked about on ESPN for a while.
Schedule's pretty favorable. Get Alabama at home. Georgia's on the road. Splitting those would be enough to get them in the playoff. But I sort of think they're in a position on defense. You'll get an unexpected stumble. They've got NC State early, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and that'll probably
You're going to call that an upset? You think Dave Doran pulls that upset, Rece?
We will make no predictions here, because I will be calling that
That's
game.
true.
Okay.
That is very true. I'll predict Kent State will not upset them in week 3.
They will not. USC, Big Ten, reason to believe, for whatever you think of Lincoln Riley, he always figures out the offense with Miller Moss, Zachariah Branch, assuming Moss holds on the quarterback job, which I think he will. Trojans will score. You don't believe in them at all.
I don't believe in them at all. I have them distinctly lower than you. Some of that is schedule-based. Some of that is just like it was Caleb a sin washer, and it becomes like a Colt McCoy. Like when he leaves, it's like, oh boy, we have a lot of problems here. I think their offensive line is pedestrian. I think their defense is better than it was, but there's still a ton of questions, and there's a lot of, like most of college football, hey, this transfer from here, this guy from here, this guy from there. Obviously, Danton Lynn is a reason to believe in the defense, but I don't think the personnel at USC right now is comparable to the personnel he had at UCLA. He had Latu coming off the edge. He was a top 10 player in the sport. So I think there is going to be a bit of transition. You've got some travel, like the new league things. The style of the new league they're going to accentuates their weakness. And I do love their young receiving core. Obviously, Zachariah Branch could be the most electrifying player in college football. Mekhi Lemons, wasn't electric his freshman year, but showed us enough signs. Deuce Robinson, again, they have 4 sophomores who could end up, if they are who we think they are, they could have on a 2-year run. But I just don't think the pieces around them. And Miller Moss, he had a great bowl, but I'm not going to just assume he's going to fill Caleb's shoes because he had a great bowl.
Yeah. The question you referenced is Danton Lynn as the defensive coordinator. They've got Matt Entz, the former North Dakota State head coach, who gives them a little experience on the defensive side of the ball as well. The question they can answer, can they play faster, fewer bust? What happens? Defense improves, offense regresses some, and the schedule, even missing Ohio State, Oregon, getting Penn State, Notre Dame at home, too much. Not in contention for the playoff come Selection Day. They open the season in Vegas against LSU. Reason to believe in LSU is the best set of tackles in college football. Will Campbell and Emory Jones. They help ease the transition post Jaden Daniels. That's a reason to believe. What question do you have about LSU?
Well, I believe in Garrett Nussmeier, but I still have questions about him, if that makes sense. And obviously Blake Baker was an elite defensive coordinator at Missouri last year, but there's a lot of new pieces. There's not a lot of defensive line depth. And look, that Missouri defense ended up having great personnel as the draft went and showed us. Ennis Rakestraw went early. Robinson went, I believe, in the first round in Detroit, right? So there was enough personnel there. I think a new coordinator for Harold Perkins could unlock him. He was one of the great teases, I think, of the 2023 season. But I'm still more in the belief than non-belief, but there are sort of reasons to be skeptical.
What happens is a favorable schedule, and the big question is, can Baker get the most out of Perkins? That's not to imply Perkins didn't have a good year last year. It's just to say that what he was in terms of a game wrecker, complete offense disruptor as a freshman, he didn't quite do that. If they can get him back to that, that will be a job well done by Blake Baker. Favorable schedule. They miss Georgia, Texas, and Missouri. They get Bama and Ole Miss at home. I'm going to say LSU sweats it out on Selection Day and just misses college football playoff.
We may talk more about them in the next pod.
We might. Oh, you think they're going to get in?
I do.
Well,
Rece.
so
I do. You just can't. I had to pick a little bit outside the. You know what I mean? There's
100%.
If there's one thing about this era of college football using the Aranda principle, it is just not going to fall in order like we think. That there's too much roster chaos. I think the top teams are still going to be the top teams, but there is going to be, especially within the SEC, when you get to that block past Georgia and Texas, who I think everybody's pretty convicted on. There's those teams are going to beat each other, and
right.
And I do think things lay out well. I am convicted LSU beats USC in Vegas. That's what I'm convicted on, and I think they do that. They get some momentum, and they go from there.
The team that had the hardest time, that I left just on the outside, that I still might debate prior to the final predictions, I guess the pod's going to be the final prediction, is Missouri. Missouri, our good friend Eli Drinkwitz, there are plenty of reasons to believe. Luther Burden, who you spent some time with, and their schedule. And I feel like I'm talking schedule too much because
it matters, man.
It does, but it ends up being, is your team good enough? I think Missouri's team is good enough, and they have a favorable schedule. Over half of their SEC opponents, and this is what I was talking about earlier, evaluating not just, they played an SEC or an ACC or Big Ten schedule. Who did you play in that schedule? In Missouri's case, over half of their opponents are coming off seasons in which they have losing records in the conference. Half of their schedule overall breaking in first-year head coaches. Now, That's reason to believe, in addition to the fact that I think they're really good, even with the losses on defense that you mentioned.
Yeah, so there are obviously going to be some questions. Corey Batoon comes over from South Al to run that unit. The personnel losses, I think, are probably more significant than the schematic difference that's going to come. One of the little pieces I picked up being out in Missouri within the last week or two is that there's a lot of optimism over Marquise Johnson. He's a sophomore receiver from Texas who had a very good freshman year, and there's really a feeling around that program that he can make a big jump. They obviously have Theo Weiss and Mookie Cooper, who are one started at Ohio State, the other started at Oklahoma. They're talented speedsters, veteran guys who are reliable. But for Brady Cook, maybe Marquise Johnson becomes another an X factor as we push on here.
They brought in some running backs too.
Our friend Nate Noel
from Appalachian State, Marcus Carroll from Georgia State coming in as well to step in the sizable shoes left behind by Cody Schrader, who's one of the great calls or great stories of last season.
Awesome.
Ultimately, I think Missouri's going to be one of the 3 or 4 teams sweating it out on Selection Day, and it could go either way for them.
Yeah,
Could go either way for them. I'm going to say they will be the team that is the maddest on Selection Day.
Interesting.
And they will present their case as if they feel like they should have been in.
I still am like a little baffled by your prediction that you don't think it's going to be this selection is going to be controversial. I just think like the loss vagaries and the schedule argument. I think it's going to be a mud fight.
I didn't say it wouldn't be controversial. What I said was that distinguishing and splitting hairs between 11 and 12.
Oh, fair.
11
Fair.
and 11 meaning the last at large bid, because 12 almost certainly is going to be the final conference champion from the group of 5. So you're splitting hairs over 11 and 12 is not the same as splitting hairs over 4 and 5.
So I guess my take is this: 10 years of the last playoff, and we take the next 10 years. I think there's more raging controversy the next 10 years than there was the prior 10. You can disagree. I mean, we're not on this podcast to think alike.
I just don't know that it will be raging controversy. It will be if what I just said comes to fruition and Missouri is left out. It will, they'll be furious in Missouri. But, beyond that, like, when Ohio State,
Missouri doesn't have feelings,
Rece? No, they do. I'm saying it's not as widespread across the country. There's not as much depth. If Notre Dame gets left out some year, or years when it came down to Ohio State and Alabama, somebody was going to be really mad. Last year was the obvious example. I don't think you're going to see that, because if you have that level of brand that gets to that point, like if Ohio State this year.
Sure.
Now, they'll be mad about a lot of things if they're in this situation. But if Ohio State is right on the edge at the end and they are left out, well, they'll be spitting mad. But they'll be madder that they didn't win enough games to make it.
That's fair.
To make it a no-brainer. So that's what I'm talking about. Missouri will be mad. There will also be some consolation that they've elevated their program to the point that they're in contention.
That's fair.
So
that's fair.
So we shall see.
I root for chaos since I can't root for teams.
Well, we'll find out what chaos. We have hinted. Each of us have a little bit of chaos in our 12 teams. Yeah. So we'll get to that next week. Great job on the Michigan stuff. As always, great job on this today.
Thank you, Rece.
And nice to see
fun.
you in person.
Yeah, it is good to spend human time together. We'll be sick of each other by mid-October because we're going to see each other every
That's
week.
True. So. And you and I tend to spend a lot of time together
we do.
And talk a lot on the road and so forth. And that's been entertaining. It's been fun. Thanks for listening to the College Game Day podcast. Please subscribe or download wherever you prefer to get it.